بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. أما بعد. السلام عليكم. We're just going to give a few minutes for the other students to join in, inshallah ta'ala. We're on time, alhamdulillah. Just a few minutes and then we will begin our session بإذن al-Kareem. All right, let's begin, inshallah ta'ala. Now, as all of you are aware, this session, in these sessions, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to have a total of 3. This is the first of the 3 sessions, inshallah. And in these sessions, we're going to talk about a very important issue, which I believe is not discussed enough. It's not talked about enough, and it's not discussed, in detail as it should be. And that is the issue of, or the topic of, how to read a book. How to read a book properly. Maybe we should add that, right? How to read a book properly. Alhamdulillah, anyone who has gone through a high school education is generally going to be comfortable with reading books, right? Whether those books are novels, whether those books are, works of some academic nature, depending on the level of their difficulty. But everyone is going to be able to read them, right? But are we reading them properly? Are we reading them in a proper way so that we're able to get the most out of them? That's the first question that we will want to answer in this session, right? Are we reading properly? And the complete answer to this question will come after we've completed the 3 sessions. After we've completed the 3 sessions, you will know the answer to this question, that are we reading what we are reading properly? In this question, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to introduce the idea of reading, what reading is in reality. And we're also going to talk about what goals, what objectives, or what the objectives of reading are, right? That's a better way of saying it, or the proper way of saying it. What the objectives of reading are, why do we read books, generally speaking. And we will end our discussion today with a discussion on the levels of reading. What are the different levels of reading? And inshallah ta'ala, in tomorrow's session, we're going to start off by going into each level in detail, right? So we'll learn today, for example, that there are 4 levels of reading. In tomorrow's session, we're going to cover each level in detail and the skills and the techniques that are required for each level of reading. Further, two books which I recommend, which I believe, to be very honest, every person, I believe that every person, every student of knowledge, and any person in general who is interested in educating themselves, who are interested in becoming independent learners, these two books should be read by them. They should read these two books. Okay? They should read these two books. Number one is How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler. And the other two, and the second book is The Well-Educated Mind by Susan Wise Bauer. The Well-Educated Mind is a book which discusses a curriculum in more detail as opposed to how to read a book. But the initial chapters are dedicated on how one should read a book. So read those chapters, even if you don't really want to go through the curriculum in philosophy and science and those subjects which she mentions. طيب. And How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler is just a classic which everyone should go through. Now, before we actually get into the discussion, right? I want you guys to participate in this really short activity, right? We're going to start with this activity, and then we're going to end the sessions, the workshop, with this activity as well. And that is that you have a passage in front of you. You're going to read the passage, and you're going to note down the problems that you face. So just take 5 minutes, right? Not more than that. You're going to read the passage, right? Just the first paragraph. You're going to note down the problems which you're facing in trying to understand this passage, right? And then inshallah ta'ala, we'll see that, by the end of the 3 sessions, are you able to present solutions for those problems based on what we have covered in the book, based on what we have covered in the book. So 5 minutes, guys. Read this first paragraph very quickly. This is from a work by Al-Manfaluti called An-Nadarat. It's the first essay from An-Nadarat called Al-Ghad. Read this first passage, right? And write down on a piece of paper, or you can take a mental note of the problems that you're facing in reading this work, right? And then inshallah ta'ala, we'll have a short discussion about that. So 5 minutes, read on your own, inshallah. All right, students, are we done? That was 5 minutes. Okay. All right, so it would be nice if you guys could unmute yourself and we could have a bit of a discussion. Which parts of this work would you say you found challenging?
It's mainly Assalamu alaikum, firstly.
Walaikum assalam, brother Hasib. Tafadhal.
It's mainly two things for me, like not knowing the vocab, then I have to look it up in a dictionary, and then I have to think about the grammar.
Okay, so it's mainly the vocab, right? Or the
Yeah.
grammar part?
Both, but vocab probably is the bigger thing.
Okay, very good. All right. Tahir, brother Tahir.
Yes.
So, yeah, tafadhal.
I struggled with the I'rab thing, but I could like manage to understand around 90%.
Okay, very good. Excellent. So grammar there. Brother Khawar.
For me, it was just, I think I understood most of it, but I'm always unsure.
All right. Very okay. Barakallah feek. Mahmoud. تفضل.
Yeah, his volume is really low.
We can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. I think because no problem. I was checking with
You're not really audible, brother Mahmoud. I can't hear you properly. I'm sorry. All right, that's fine. Let's move on from there, inshallah ta'ala. If you could please type down your answer, brother Mahmoud, and I'd love to know, what you have to say. Okay, similar. So grammar and vocabulary. Okay. Now, this problem that we're facing with vocabulary or grammar, this is what we would call problems with elementary reading, right? Reading is of 4 levels. Adler, in his book, he mentions that, the first part of elementary reading, of course, is word recognition and being able to understand what the basic meaning of a sentence is. And so once you go beyond the level of elementary reading in any particular language, that's when you move to other further levels like inspectional reading, analytical reading, and syntopical reading, which are the 4 types which inshallah ta'ala we're going to talk about in detail in tomorrow's session. Right? But okay, very good. Now we'll see inshallah ta'ala which tips from Adler can help us, inshallah ta'ala, with the problems that we're facing with our reading and how we can, as they say, turn it up a notch, inshallah ta'ala. So now I believe this is a very important quote. This is something which Adler mentions in the introduction of his book. And I feel that this is where the spirit of this workshop, the whole workshop, all 3 sessions, lies in, right? If I wanted to summarize this workshop in like a few sentences, it would be this. He says, one constant is that to achieve all the purposes of reading, the desideratum, which means the desired thing, must be the ability to read different things at different appropriate speeds. Not everything at the greatest possible speed. As Pascal observed 300 years ago, when we read too fast or too slowly, we understand nothing. The whole idea is that we need to fix how we read in order to gain the most from any particular work. Now, remember, there are some general governing principles on how to read a book, but then there are certain specific principles regarding which genre you would read. And that is what we're going to cover in our third session, inshallah ta'ala. That, you know, if you're approaching the genre of literature, which is our genre mainly, how is one supposed to approach a work of literature, right? And then there are other genres as well, like science or philosophy, and of course those things would be helpful. For example, if someone is studying aqidah, if someone is studying kalam, if someone is studying fiqh, right? Conceptual subjects, then what the Western academics have discussed with regards to the techniques of reading philosophical works and scientific works, and works of humanities covering sociology, anthropology, and so on and so forth. The techniques there would help a student of knowledge in reading books of fiqh, books of aqidah, and so on and so forth. So inshallah ta'ala, we're going to discuss those things in our third session, bi'idhnillah al-kareem. But today we want to get a feel of the subject. So the important thing is, number one, that we need to keep in our mind that whatever we're learning, inshallah ta'ala, we want to apply it. All of this is being learned for practical purposes. None of this has a lot of theoretical value. It's only valuable if we apply it to our reading. So I'm going to start off with a basic question. So in the age of social media, where we gain information passively, even though technically any time you're gaining information and, you know, you're learning something, it's not fully and completely passive. There is a level of activity involved with any sort of effort in learning. Even when you're reading, when you're listening, it's not really passive or fully passive. But it's when you gain information from social media, it's almost passive. Social media gives you packaged opinions, packaged views on things, and you sort of gain the impression that, you know, you're coming to a conclusion on your own. But really, what you're doing is you're taking information, and we end up regurgitating what we hear a lot, right? And we sort of get packaged information like that. With reading, it's much different. With reading, you're not just gaining packaged information and packaged views. Rather, you're expected to think, you're expected to debate, you're expected to consider different sides when you're reading. And that's what analytical reading is all about, which we're going to talk about as well, inshallah ta'ala. Okay? So in the age of social media, where we gain information passively, is an active art like reading still relevant? And the answer to that is yes, of course. Of course it is relevant. Reading to this day remains one of the most important ways of learning new things and understanding things better. Another question. So one must differentiate between knowing and understanding. Media might throw a lot of information at us, but do we have a better understanding of everything? Adler actually argues that we don't. He says that in this day and age, and he's writing in the I believe in the mid towards the late 1900s, and even in that time he's saying, you know, that we know more about the world because of television and radio at that time. Of course, those were the technological advancements of that time. Adler didn't live to see the iPhone 14 Pro Max, but I think a lot of what he said still applies today. It applies more so today, to be very honest. He said we do have a lot more information, we do know more about the world, but we don't have a better understanding of the world, right? Knowing more doesn't necessarily mean that you understand more. Sometimes, even when you know little, you understand a lot, right? And that's why, for example, you'll find that some of the greatest scholars, they had very brief libraries, right? Very brief libraries. Their libraries were not, you know, huge, but because they really understood the essential principles, the essential ulum al-ala, Nahu, Sarf, Balagha, Usul al-Fiqh, and so on and so forth, they were able to derive much more from the Quran and the Sunnah. And you can see the pious predecessors, the Sahaba Tabi'un, the Atba'u Tabi'in, they were like that as well. You know, now, in order to reach an understanding, a good understanding of a subject, you need to read multiple books. But the Sahaba, just with the proper understanding of the Arabic language, what they were able to deduce from the Quran and the Sunnah, you know, we still find it really, really challenging, right? Especially, you know, when it comes to fiqh rulings regarding matters and so on and so forth. So knowing more does not equal to understanding more. Sometimes, even if you know little, that little knowledge can contribute to a better understanding of things. Now, one note before we finally delve into the subject matter, that is, Adler is generally talking about books written in a language we already know. Although in the last chapter of the first unit, he talks about reading books in different languages when he talks about elementary reading. But generally, when it comes to analytical reading, for example, or syntopical reading, it is already assumed that the person has a pretty good grasp of the language, right? So not every principle that we will study, every technique we will talk about in analytical reading and in syntopical reading, not all of it is going to apply to us at the moment as far as our literature program is concerned and our reading is concerned. It can apply to us after we've covered 2-3 books, right? Inshallah ta'ala. But in anyways, don't limit what we're going to learn in these workshops to just this program. This is going to help you with any reading that you do. You know, if you're a student of knowledge, you're studying other subjects, you're studying at an institute, you're studying with a teacher. These 3 workshops are, inshallah ta'ala, they're going to help you a lot in digesting that material as well. But since we are speaking in context of the Arabic literature program, I will be alluding to it every now and then. But these principles here are general, right? So not everything we read here, or not everything that you read in How to Read a Book by Adler is applicable to our reading of Kalila or Dimna, but most of the general skills and techniques, they still apply. طيب. Alhamdulillah. Now that we're done with introductions, let's talk about reading. What is reading? So reading, very simply, is an activity, right? Reading is something that we do actively. Although someone might think that reading is a passive endeavor, but it really isn't. It's an active endeavor. Yes, the amount of effort you exert in reading can determine the level of how active it is. So you can read more actively or less actively. And as a general principle, the first qaida, in a way, the first maxim or the first principle, which Adler mentions in his book, is the more actively we read, the better we read. And the less actively read, you know, the worse we're reading, essentially speaking. What does active reading really mean? That is something that's going to come up when we talk in detail about the levels, right? But what you can understand at this moment from the word actively is the amount of effort you put in to the activity of reading. All right, the more you think about the things, the more you might go back and reread. You might read slower, and so on and so forth. The more actively we read, the better we read. طيب. So Adler says, one reader is better than another in proportion as he is capable of a greater range of activity in reading and exerts more effort. He is better if he demands more of himself and of the text before him, right? So reading more actively or less actively, these are of course relative concepts. These are relative concepts, and one reader is better is better than another reader, and that's also a relative concept based on on his capability of a greater range of activity in reading and his ability to exert more effort in that regard. And it's also very important to note that different works require different levels of reading. So the way you read Jane Austen, for example, is not the way that you read Shakespeare. And the way you read Shakespeare or entertainment literature is not the way you read academic literature. The level of effort that you put in, right? If you're a good reader, you will know how much effort you need to exert in reading a particular book. If you're reading a philosophical treatise, if you're reading a fiqhi treatise, then you'll need to exert more effort, right? Because you're not just reading for improving your language, or you're not just reading to gain more vocabulary words. You also want to really understand the concepts and everything that comes under them. When you're studying fiqh, you want to understand all the tafri'at. So if you're studying Kitab al-Tahara, for example, right, from any book, whether it's Mukhtasar al-Quduri for the Hanafis, or Safinat al-Najah for the Shafi'is, or Bidayat al-Abid or Zad al-Mustaqni' for the Hanbalis, or Ibn Ashur for the Malikis, and so on and so forth. When they talk about the types of water, you want to understand what those types of water are, what is the hukum, the ruling of each type, right? For which purpose can each of these be used, and so on and so forth. You want to understand all the concepts there. So the level of effort that you will exert in that type of reading is going to be different than the level of effort that you exert in reading which is for entertainment purposes, for example, right? So a good reader is someone who knows how to properly read. They know how to exert the required amount of effort, right? And Adler sort of uses this extended metaphor in his book about the idea of catching. So if someone's familiar with baseball, or American football or cricket, catching is involved in those sports. You might think that the batsman in cricket, for example, is the only one who is actively playing a part, and the bowler, and the fielder is more of a passive. The fielder has more of a passive role, but that's not really true. When a batsman hits the ball, right, and the fieldsman is trying to catch the ball, that's an activity, right? He's doing something actively, right? Now, it can be done more actively or less actively, but it's an activity, right? And a good catcher would be able to catch the ball from different angles in different situations. And that's how a good reader is as well, right? The good reader will be able to catch every sort of communication. He'll be able to read anything and everything. He'll be able to get the most out of them, because he will know the technique to do that, just as the catcher of the ball knows the right technique for catching, which type of, hit, for example. طيب. So the question now is, after we know that reading is an activity, we know that we should read more actively, we know that what we should aim towards is becoming such readers that we're able to understand any book that we pick up, right? So what does better reading mean? What does it mean to become a better reader? So Adler answers this appropriately. He says, given the same thing to read, one person reads it better than another, first by reading it more actively, and second by performing each of the acts involved more skillfully. Reading is a complex activity, just as writing is. It consists of a large number of separate acts, all of which must be performed in a good reading. The person who can perform more of them is better able to read. Okay, so reading is not just one complete simple act, right? it's not like an nashat basit, as we might say in Arabic, right? But it's murakkab, it's complex, right? It's complex. It involves sub-acts, right? And a good reader is going to be reading more actively, and he's going to be performing each of the acts involved in the larger act of reading more skillfully, right? So in these workshops, that's what we're going to learn, inshallah ta'ala, what these acts are, how we can perform them more skillfully to become better readers, and how we can read more actively. طيب. Now, apart from being an activity, reading is also an art. It's an art. So Adler says here, thus we can roughly define what we mean by the art of reading as follows: the process whereby a mind with nothing to operate on but the symbols of the by the power of own operations. The mind passes from understanding less to understanding more. The skilled operations that cause this to happen are the various acts that constitute the art of reading. Now, we've already established that reading is a complex activity, right? And the majority of what Adler is going to focus on, right, what he focuses on in his book, is reading independently, reading on your own without external help. He does talk about reading with a commentary, reading with an instructor, with a teacher, but he has talked about the most difficult type of reading here, where you have nothing but the book and your own mind. And you need to figure that book out on your own. Now, of course, in this course, alhamdulillah, it's not like that. You're not just reading on your own. There's supplementary material. There are live sessions. You'll ask questions as well. And all of that you need to do, inshallah ta'ala, to gain the maximum benefit from this course, right? But the techniques that you will use in reading, right, are those or you'll use them while imagining, or with imagining, that you have no other external help. While you're reading, you're going to try to get the most out of what you're reading without any external help. And once you're done with that, then you can ask for help. Then you can ask for help. You can consult material. You can ask questions, and so on and so forth. This is going to help you become a better reader. It's going to help you become an artist in a way. طيب. We've understood what reading is. What are the goals of reading? Why do we read in the first place? This might sound like a very simple question. You might say, why even talk about this? But this is an essential question that must be answered before you pick up any book to read. If I'm picking up Jane Austen, right? Or if I'm picking up Shakespeare, or I'm picking up Cormac McCarthy, right? I will generally have the goal of entertainment in mind. That's going to be my goal. I'm not going to read, The Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy as I read Matan Abi Shuja', right? I'm not going to read The Taming of the Shrew, for example, as I read a book on Aqidah, for example, or a book on Sirah. So the goal that I have in mind is going to define how I'm going to read. Okay? So Adler says, you have a mind, alhamdulillah. Now let us suppose that you also have a book that you want to read. The book consists of a language written by someone for the sake of communicating something to you. Your success in reading it is determined by the extent to which you receive everything the writer intended to communicate. And for you to be able to do that, for you to be able to gain that benefit, that intended outcome, the goal needs to be clear in your mind. Are you reading this for entertainment, or are you reading it for some other purpose? And Adler mentions three main goals of reading. There are three main goals: reading for understanding, reading for information, and reading for entertainment. Now, someone might say, what's the difference between understanding and information here? Well, there's a fine line between them. These two are distinct. And we're going to talk about how they are distinct, inshallah. But reading for information is much easier than reading for understanding, right? When you're reading for information, you're simply reading for facts, you gain that information, you digest it, that's it. But when you're reading for understanding, you're aiming for something beyond the information, right? You really want a complete grasp of that topic, in essence. And Adler mentions that reading for understanding is the most demanding. It is the most demanding of all the three goals, right? So when you read to gain a better understanding of something, you move from a state of understanding less to a state of understanding more. There's a process of elevation there. You're elevating yourself from one state to a higher state, from a lower state to a higher state. When you're reading for understanding, you're trying to get a better grasp of that subject itself, right? Or of that issue itself. You want to discuss it from all sides. You want to know it from all sides. You don't just want to know what the issue is, but why it is like that, and so on and so forth. Now, this is the highest and the most important goal of reading, and that is why it is the most demanding. That is why it is the most demanding. Someone can pick up a book on history, like the history of America, for example, or the history of Europe, or the history of any particular country, for example. And they can gain information that, you know, so-and-so country gained independence in this year, so-and-so country, you know, the governmental system or the political system is such, you know, it's a Westminster type government, or it's a different type of government, so on and so forth. But that's just information. But when you're going deeper into the topics, when you want to understand why things are the way they are, right? Like, you can know, right, that a world war was started by a man named Gavrilo Princip, right? But why that happened, who, you know, deserves the blame for the world war, and so on and so forth, all of that, you know, all of that is a discussion which is related to understanding. It's more than just having the information about an event. When Gavrilo Princip tried to assassinate an emperor, right? That's just information. But getting deep into that and how the world war actually started, who mobilized first, who mobilized second, and after the mobilization of armies, what happened, what led to what, you're gaining a deeper understanding beyond information when you're asking why, and so on and so forth. And like, I'm just touching on this to give you guys an idea. All of this, Adler talks about it in more detail. So when you're reading for understanding, you're moving from a state of less understanding to a state of more understanding. Reading for information is less demanding, right? You read for information to gain information about something. It is a good goal, but it's less demanding. And there are times when reading for information and reading for understanding go hand in hand. Are these two distinct? Are these two distinct? Yes, they are. They're distinct goals. But at times they go hand in hand, right? So sometimes you could be reciting something, reciting a few facts, right? But through the recitation of those facts, through the reading of those facts, you know, you have a light bulb moment, you gain a better understanding of something. So that can happen, but they are distinct goals. Then we have, of course, reading for entertainment. And this is the least demanding form of reading. And Adler says, very casually, there are no rules for it. When you're reading for entertainment, there are no rules for that. But there are rules for how you read for understanding and how you read for information. So when you're reading for understanding, you take a book. This is the first thing. You take a book which is beyond your level. It is difficult for you to understand. You're not taking something which is at your level. You're taking something beyond your level. That's a prerequisite. If you want to read a book for understanding, you need to take something which is beyond your level, something that you don't already understand. And you start working on it without external help. So without commentaries or a tutor. And with nothing but the power of your mind, of course, if you seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you start to make sense of it. This is what Adler calls reading for understanding. Of course, you can gain a better understanding by consulting commentaries and studying with a teacher as well. But Adler is mainly interested in independent reading. So he talks about reading without external help a lot. And by reading, so the techniques that he's going to mention in analytical reading, reading for understanding, they're going to be based on the presupposition that you're exerting a lot of effort, you're reading on your own. Imagine that you use those principles while you're studying with a commentary with a tutor. It's going to double the benefit that you gain from a work. So you move from a state of understanding less to a state of understanding more. And this elevation requires skilled and demanding reading. So you were reading from something from someone with a superior understanding from you, and now you bridge that inequality. By the time you're done with the book, you have bridged that gap. You're on par in understanding with the writer. Of course, to a varying degree. It doesn't always mean that you'll gain the same knowledge or you have the same understanding as the writer exactly, but that's the goal. That's what we're aiming for. Guys, just give me 2 minutes. Please stay, don't go. Just give me 2 minutes. I'm going to be back. Apologies. طيب. Let's continue. So when you're reading to gain a better understanding of something, You're trying to bridge the gap. Initially, there's an inequality. You're reading from someone who's superior to you in understanding. You're reading a book beyond your level. And by the time you're done with the reading, you're on par with the book, with the writer. So Adler says here, to pass from understanding less to understanding more by your own intellectual effort in reading is something like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It certainly feels that way. It is a major exertion. Obviously, it is a more active kind of reading than you have done before, entailing not only more varied activity, but also much more skill in the performance of the various acts required. So, you exert a lot of effort, you read more actively, the individual acts of reading that way, you perform them properly, and you bridge that gap. Now, the main difference in reading for understanding and reading for information is in the latter, is that in the latter, this type of you might be gaining information, yes, but you're able to gain it without exerting that much effort. So the former is more demanding, whereas the latter, reading for information, is less demanding. The two pillars of reading for understanding are, number one, there is an initial inequality in understanding. And number two, the reader must be able to overcome this inequality to some degree. Now, it's a relevant point here. It's not really related to reading, but more so with teaching. The idea of dumbing down books too much for students, I generally don't agree with that idea. When you're teaching the student a book, whether it's in a Dars Nizami setting or a university setting, you're studying the Islamic subjects, other subjects, but I'm talking more in the context of ulum al-shar'iyya, for students of knowledge. Instead of dumbing books down, teachers need to focus on bringing the students to the level of the book. This is something which a famous Azhari Sheikh also mentioned in one of his Facebook posts. So at times what happens is we simplify the material so much, we dumb it down so much to make it easy that the student is not progressing any further. So when a student is studying something, there is an initial inequality. Someone who starts studying Ajur Rumiya or Nahu Mir or Matnul Bina in Sarf, for example, he doesn't know the Nahu that is in there, right? He doesn't understand the concepts that are in there. He doesn't know how to apply those concepts. But instead of bringing the books down to the level of the students should be brought up to the level of the book, so that by the end, that inequality has been bridged and the student can move on to the next book, move to its level, and the next, and like that. Like that. That's how books should be taught. Then Adler says something very important. He says, we do not want to give the impression that facts leading to increased information and insights leading to increased understanding are always easy to distinguish. So like I said, there's a very fine line between reading for information and reading for understanding. And at times both go hand in hand. And we would admit that sometimes a mere recital of facts can itself lead to greater understanding. The point we want to emphasize here is that this book is about the art of reading for the sake of increased understanding. Fortunately, if you learn to do that, reading for information will usually take care of itself. So that means that if you know how to read for understanding, you can easily read for the sake of information. Very simply. All right. That is reading for understanding, and that's the main goal. That is the main goal. There are a few quotes from the book which I want to bring to your attention. Reading as learning, right? So of course we read in order to learn, but there are different kinds of learning. Getting more information is learning, and so is coming to understand what you did not understand before. But there's an important difference between these two kinds of learning. To be informed is to know simply that something is the case. To be enlightened is to know, in addition, what it is all about, i.e., why it is the case, what its connections are with other facts, in what respects it is the same, in what respects it is different, and so forth. That is reading for understanding. That's the difference between reading for information and reading for understanding. If you remember what an author says, you have learned something from reading him. If what he says is true, you have learned something about the world. But whether it is a fact about the book or a fact about the world that you have learned, you have gained nothing but information if you have exercised only your memory. You have not been enlightened. Enlightenment is achieved only when, in addition to knowing what an author says, you know what he means and why he says it. It is true, of course, that you should be able to remember what the author said as well as know what he meant. Being informed is prerequisite to being enlightened. The point, however, is not to stop at being informed. So in a way, you can think that reading for information in a subject that you're not informed about, reading for information is the first step to reading for understanding. Someone who hasn't studied Nahu much, right? You can't accept him to gain a high level of understanding of the subject just by reading Ajurumiyah, for example. Ajurumiyah is for the first stage, for being informed. Our scholars put down these texts for specific purposes. When you are done with just the method of Ajurumiyah, you're more informed about Nahu, right? But you'll become enlightened about things when you read further, when you go into Hawashi, when you study higher texts. That's when you'll be becoming enlightened regarding the subject. You will know why things are the way they are, right? And so on and so forth. Adler mentions two methods of learning, learning by discovery and learning by instruction, aided discovery. Now, we often think of discovering as something which is more difficult, and it is very difficult, right? Edison, made the first light bulb. Someone made the first wheel. Those are discoveries, right? They really did things from scratch, right? Ibn Haytham, when he designed the camera obscura, that was, from scratch, right? When he talked about the scientific method, it was, so those are like discoveries in essence, okay? Maybe the scientific method he got, he got inspiration from the Quran. Allah knows best. But, inventions and things like that, and, the discovery of gravity, for example, the famous anecdote of the apple, the falling apple and Newton and so on and so forth. Discoveries are difficult. With discoveries, you're observing the natural world, and then you have light bulb moments where, pun intended, you have light bulb moments, and you basically discover something. It's unaided. It's unaided. But with instruction, so with discovery, when you're making a discovery, you're thinking really hard. You're imagining, you're sensing things, right? Someone might think that when we're learning by instruction, when we're learning in a classroom, a teacher is giving a lecture, or when we're reading a book, that also comes under learning by instruction, that doesn't require that level of thinking or doesn't require imagination. But that's wrong. Learning by instruction should be looked at as a discovery as well, but it's aided discovery. It's discovery with some help. you should still have the mind of someone who is trying to discover something. All right? So learning by discovery is when you learn without the help of an instructor. So Adler says, when, however, the learner proceeds without the help of any sort of teacher, the operations of learning are performed on nature or the world rather than on discourse. So by discourse, you're listening to something, or reading something that would be another type of learning from instruction. So learning from instruction is when you learn with the help of an instructor. So with discovery, your operations of learning, your thinking, your imagination, you sensing the world around you, all of that is performed on the nature, on the world, not on some discourse, not on written material or spoken material. But when you're learning by instruction, when you learn with the help of an instructor, that's learning by instruction, right? So when he says, when he's being instructed, discovering with the help of a teacher, notice how he phrases it. He calls instruction discovering with the help of a teacher. The learner acts on something communicated to him. He performs operations on discourse, written or oral. He learns by acts of reading or listening. So don't think of that when you're sitting in a classroom, it's just a passive thing. You're just noting down things, just trying to remember them. Don't think of it as a passive activity. You're still trying to discover things. You're still expected to think. You're still expected to use your sense and imagination. When you're reading a poem, right? When you're reading a poem, imagine the situation that the author is in. Imagine the situation that the poet is in. When you're reading a book, imagine those scenarios, right? Think of them deeply. Think about the underpinnings. Think about the consequences of what the author is saying, and so on and so forth. So he says, to engage in both types of learning, one must employ a number of skills. Number one, thinking. And number two, sense and imagination. So thinking and sense and imagination are not just limited to learning by discovery. When you're trying to discover something from scratch without any help, you still need these two skills when you're learning by instruction. So reading or aided discovery involve these as much as unaided discovery. When we read, we must imagine, we must think, we must sense, we must construct images in our mind as we're reading. We must think of the hows and the whys and the whens and the whats. Adler says, the art of reading, in short, includes all of the same skills that are involved in the art of unaided discovery: keenness of observation, readily available memory, range of imagination, and of course, an intellect trained in analysis and reflection. The reason for this is that reading in this sense is discovery too, although with help instead of without it. This is how you need to imagine the art of reading, right? So far, we've gained understanding of what reading is, what the main goals from reading are, so that we're able to define our goal before we start reading. And now we're getting into the right mindset, how we should think about the activity of reading. Okay? And continuing with the mindset, imagine the book as an absent teacher. The book is an absent teacher. You're reading Ghazali. Imagine, it's like you're sitting in one of the majalis of Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, and he's giving that information to you. You're reading a book by Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi. You're reading a book from one of the earlier Imams. You're reading a book from Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. Their spirit, by spirit I don't mean their soul, right? But the spirit of their teachings are in those books, right? So the book is an absent teacher. The book is an absent teacher. When we listen, we are usually listening to a teacher who is alive. If we get confused or we have questions, we can answer them. But with reading, we must answer the questions ourselves. At least we should try to in the first go, right? Good readers try to do that. They try to make connections. They try to ask questions. Of course, that doesn't mean that you always have to do that with a book, that, you know, oh, you can't approach a commentary, or reading, you're studying Qatr al-Nada, or don't buy the Sharh of Ibn Hisham. No, of course, that's not what we're saying, right? But the more effort that you exert when you're reading yourself, right, you will be able to benefit more from the commentaries and after asking the teachers, but you need to exert effort yourself to try to understand that thing. So this, of course, is not always the case. We can read books with teachers, and teachers can answer questions. But other works, there are works that remain for us to explore further using our own faculties, especially after we've graduated. When I say graduated, I don't mean graduating from a particular program, right? I mean, you've studied the basic ulum. Now you're at a level where you're reading texts on your own, books that are not usually taught in curriculums, right? Ihya Ulumuddin by Imam al-Ghazali, the whole book is not taught as a curriculum, right? There are many works that are not taught as curriculum, but you need to be able to read them. And you need to be able to explore them on your own as well. Not all books have commentaries. You know, you might not always find a teacher. So you, even as a student of knowledge, you are aiming for that level of independence. Alhamdulillah, we've understood what reading is. We've understood what the goals of reading are. And we've understood what the mindset of a student, what the mindset of a reader should be, how you should imagine a book, how you should imagine the art of reading. Now, what are the different levels of reading? Inshallah ta'ala, this is the last thing that we're going to study, and we're going to end with this, inshallah ta'ala, for today. So the levels of reading, Adler says there are 4 levels of reading. They're here called levels rather than kinds, because kinds, strictly speaking, are distinct from one another. Whereas it is characteristic of levels that higher ones include lower ones. So it is with the levels of reading, which are cumulative. The first level is not lost in the second in the third in the fourth. In fact, the fourth and highest level of reading includes all the others. It simply goes beyond them. So these are levels of reading, right? And when you're reading at level 4, all the previous levels are still there. It's not like when you move on to study Alfiyat ibn Malik, you forget everything in Ajrumi and Qatr al-Nada. No, you're using that information to understand Alfiyah, right? So you're still going to be using the first 3 levels when you're at reading at level 4. When you're reading at level 3, you will still be utilizing the first 2 levels, and so on and so forth. Now, the 4 levels are elementary reading, inspectional reading, which is also systematic skimming. This is very different from the skimming that we used to hearing, right? Analytical reading, and finally syntopical reading, also called comparative reading, which is the most difficult level. Okay, what is elementary reading? So elementary reading is the type of reading which is learned during elementary school. You're basically looking at things like word recognition. You know, in elementary school, you learn how to recognize letters, how to recognize words, how you put them together, how you start to make sense of a sentence, right? So at this level of reading, the question that the reader is basically asking is, what does the sentence say? So what is the basic meaning of the sentence, right? That's the most basic form of reading. Then we have inspectional reading. And inspectional reading is characterized with special focus on time. So reading a book or a chapter with a specified time limit. Inspectional reading is not done without a time limit. It needs to be done within a time limit. And this is done through systematic skimming, right? This is not the kind of skimming that we usually think of. You know, you take a book and you flip its pages. That's not what we're talking about here. right? The Adler is going to mention all the steps of inspectional reading, so I'm not going to mention them now. That's going to be discussed in tomorrow's session, inshallah. But in inspectional reading, you're systematically skimming a book to gain a better idea of it. You're not going to understand everything, but you will understand some basic things. So he says another way to describe this level of reading is to say that its aim is to get the most out of a book within a given time. Within a given time. This is really key, guys, right? When reading at this level, your aim is to examine the surface of the book, to learn everything that the surface alone can teach you. That is often a good deal. And you'll be able to answer questions. So you ask questions and you answer questions like, what is the book about? What is the structure of the book? What are the parts of the book? And so on and so forth. And once you're done with inspectional reading, you can answer the question, what kind of book is it? Is it a novel, a history, a scientific treatise? So essentially, you're scratching the surface, really, but you're getting a better understanding of what the book is, what the book is about. So a note here, Adler says, we do not want to stress, however, we do want to stress, however, that most people, even many quite good readers, are unaware of the value of inspectional reading. They're unaware of the value of inspectional reading. They start a book on page 1 and plow steadily through it without even reading the table of contents. They are thus faced with the task of achieving a superficial knowledge of the book at the same time that they're trying to understand it. That compounds the difficulty. Okay, so inspectional reading is something that you do before you want to deeply understand the book. That's level 2. Level 3 is analytical reading, and this is more demanding and difficult than the above 2 levels. Adler says analytical reading is thorough reading, complete reading, or good reading, the best reading you can do. That's analytical reading. The analytical reader must ask many and organized questions of what he is reading. We also want to stress that analytical reading is hardly ever necessary if your goal in reading is simply information or entertainment. Analytical reading is preeminently for the sake of understanding. That's what analytical reading is for. Just one moment, guys. So analytical reading is more demanding than elementary and inspectional reading. And Adler says it's the best reading you can do. But this is the type of reading you do for the sake of understanding, not just for the sake of information or entertainment. The final and the most difficult type of reading is syntopical reading. This is the most complex and systematic level. It is also called comparative reading. And you do syntopical reading when you're reading many books. So Adler says, when reading syntopically, the reader reads many books, not just one, and places them in relation to one another and to a subject about which they all revolve. But mere comparisons of the texts is not enough. Syntopical reading involves more. With the help of books read, the syntopical reader is able to construct an analysis of the subject that may not be in any of the books. That's syntopical reading, and that is the most difficult type of reading. You're reading many books on a subject to gain a greater understanding, but not just that. At the end of syntopical reading, you will be able to construct an analysis of that subject which does not exist in other works. So these are the 4 levels of reading: elementary, inspectional, analytical, and syntopical. Inshallah ta'ala, we're going to cover the skills and techniques of each level, and you'll be able to pick out the techniques that you need in order to gain maximum benefit from Kalila wa Dimna, right? We'll be able to pick out which techniques are most relevant to us for our literature program, right? And of course, as you go beyond, inshallah ta'ala, so Kalila Udimna is just the first installment. After this, we have Al-Bukhala by Jahiz. We have poetry. We have other works, inshallah ta'ala. As you progress, of course, in your level of reading, the more you'll become a more independent reader. You'll be less dependent on dictionaries and supplementary material. Of course, some of you are advanced learners as well. So you're still not dependent, right? But of course, there's always room to improve. There's always room to improve. The more you read, the better your vocabulary gets, the better your grasp of topics and subject matter gets. But just to summarize, in this session, we talked about what reading is, how a reader should view the activity of reading, what the goals of reading should be, right? Or what they can be, and the importance of defining your goal, having your goal in mind before you start reading a book. And finally, we discussed the levels of reading in brief, what they are about. And inshallah ta'ala, we're going to discuss the techniques within each level in tomorrow's session. Barakallah fikum for attending and listening and participating. With that, I'm going to end my monologue. If you have any questions, you're free to ask. تفضلوا. I guess there are no questions. The presentation, the notes which we're showing, they've been sent to the group as well, inshallah ta'ala, so you guys can refer back to them. Bi'idhnillah al-kareem. Barakallah fikum for attending. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.